Hello, everyone. So a sign in India was admonishing people how to take care of their used cigarettes. And it said instead, both in Hindi and then in English underneath, instead of using the word cigarette, it said, please do not drop butt into the toilet bowl. Or see, please do not drop your butt into the toilet bowl. Slight misuse of words, and exactly why you need professional language agencies to make sure that your meaning is conveyed correctly. So with that, today's guest is Karina Sotnik. Karina is the CEO of WorldUpstart, a Philadelphia-based firm that empowers overseas tech companies, especially in the biosciences, to enter the US by optimizing strategies and connecting prospects with players, partners, and investors. WorldUpstart also works with universities and government agencies internationally to build commercialization programs that foster the creation of innovative, viable, and scalable startup companies based on academic discovery and research. Karina is a serial entrepreneur, mentor, and advisor with over a decade of experience creating entrepreneurial ecosystems through innovation programs with significant economic impact. She has extensive experience in academic innovation, incubation, acceleration, and global soft landing programs for startups, universities, and international organizations. Welcome, Karina. Delighted that you're with us today.
Thank you so much, Philip, for inviting me. Really appreciate it.
So as your WorldUpstart website says, entering the US market can be overwhelming, entering the US market for an American company can be overwhelming. But let's start with some of the major issues of bringing overseas companies, particularly in the biosciences, to the US. What would you suggest?
Yes, and we work with biosciences and MedTech, so I just want to broaden our umbrella a little bit, and that includes digital health companies. I think there are many challenges, right? So I can just run through some of them, which would be obviously the regulatory, the FDA approval, and how to understand the pathway to FDA and the cost associated with that. Competition. We see a lot of foreign companies coming from smaller markets really underestimate how much competition they will face here in the US, because US has a very robust bioscience and medtech industries, and US continues to innovate. So companies really need to be aware of their local competition here, and we will touch on competition a little bit later, I'm sure. Understanding what problem they will be solving in the US. US healthcare is so vastly different from the rest of the world that, you know, if they solve a surgeon's problem somewhere in Norway, it wouldn't necessarily translate here if they're dealing with insurance companies. So understanding really whose problem you will be solving and who your customer is in the US is a really big key issue that companies need to understand. And then, of course, reimbursement, right? Again, our US healthcare is very different from one payer system elsewhere. And so understanding how that works, how to work with insurance companies, how to be paid for your product becomes key. And finally, all of this that I just mentioned, plus I didn't even mention employment, because employment law in the United States is really different from anywhere else, right? So understanding all of these key components become crucial when companies come here to fundraise, because to convince investors to invest in you, you really need to understand all of those aspects that I've mentioned. So there are plenty of challenges, but I have to say US market is very big and very desirable, and companies absolutely need to look at US market as their next obvious step for expansion.
Yeah, very true. And I guess if you're talking in reverse, taking US companies abroad, it's the same kinds of issues, just different for their own systems.
Right. Plus, I would say, and we will probably talk about misconceptions later, but, you know, US is very diverse, and so are other countries. The logical next step for US companies to expand are usually to Germany, and that is the gateway to EU, Germany being one of the largest in European Union. And then some companies look at Japan to enter the Asian market. So in Germany, you also have diversity. You have different states have their own incentives. So not looking at the country as a country, but actually looking at the regions and understanding which region is better for you becomes really an important key consideration.
Yeah, very interesting. One of the most fascinating issues that I find is that foreigners gain their information about the US based on American movies and television shows very often. And, you know, even if they make trips here, or multiple trips here, they're still very surprised, shall we say, if not shocked, when they move here and confront the reality of living in the United States and having to deal with American business on a daily basis. And of course, when they invest, there are other issues as well. What do you think most inbound foreign executives forget about or simply not know about when they enter the US market?
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about this. I think a lot of people underestimate how diverse and vast United States is. And I always tell companies, you will be dealing with 51 countries when coming to US, 50 states plus federal, right? When we're
maybe 52.
Right, exactly. But when we're talking about, you know, employment laws and regulatory, right? Each state has their own differentiators, but culturally, it's even, I think, more important to understand that doing business in Louisiana might be vastly different from doing business in New York or California. So understanding those differences, understanding the priorities where you want to go first as your first entry into US and then expand within US becomes really critical because, you know, there are a lot of cultural differences, obviously, between other countries and US, but there are also plenty of cultural differences within US. If you look at different regions, the Midwest versus, you know, the coastal cities. So I would say that is important. It also affects, obviously, your customers' behaviors, right? So how you're going to market your product into different parts of US, the messaging that you're going to use, it all becomes really important. And you know, it's important for consumer product, but it's also important for enterprise because, you know, people operate in their cultural realm. Another one of the biggest misconceptions that's such a red flag for me is they always underestimate US competition. You know, even if the product is completely novel, the way things are done today, the way the problem that you're solving is solved here today is your competition, and you have to address it. People do not change their behaviors easily, right? And so understanding how you're going to get your customer to change and adopt your product becomes key, and cultural consideration plays a huge role there. So I would say these two are probably the biggest.
Can you give some specific examples of perhaps how a product might be marketed differently, say in Minnesota versus Louisiana or Georgia? I mean, one's talking about the, you know, northern versus southern.
Well, I mean, obvious and maybe, you know, the hottest and the most controversial is reproductive rights and, right, you know, product for reproductive
yes,
right. So, you know, things of that nature, it's really important to understand not just the laws, but also culturally how it's going to be introduced to the market. So that's like the obvious example, right?
Right, that's true. I thought perhaps it would be involving like a medical product as opposed to a cultural issue, but yes, you're right.
Well, the medical product for
those issues.
For those issues, right? Exactly. So,
what about MedTech and biotech companies, what kinds of issues do they face that perhaps manufacturing companies would not face coming into the US?
Yeah, well, the most obvious is regulatory, right? So the biosciences, the MedTech, very regulated. And so understanding the path to regulatory approval is really important. Although I have to caution companies, sometimes they think that this is like the final milestone. And once they get FDA approval, they're golden. They're not. The road is bumpy after that as well. So, but regulatory is one of the biggest issues. Another one is IP, right? Low tech might not be crucially relying on intellectual property, but biosciences and medtech, you bet it, that intellectual property is crucial to their well-being and survival in the United States. So understanding how you can expand on it, how you can keep competition at bay with it, how you cannot infringe on other rights, all of that becomes very, very important. And we see a lot of companies not succeeding because of IP issues. Then also, obviously, distribution channels, understanding how to work with partners like hospitals or insurance companies, clinics, is hugely important for success, or pharma for success in the United States. And low-tech companies might not face that, but they face their own challenges like logistics, right, and supply chain. So yeah, so and lastly, I would say the biggest difference, I think, also is in talent acquisition. Where do you find people that are trained and skillful in supporting and continuing to build your product? And that's where also understanding the difference in location within the United States becomes critical. So collecting all the data, understanding where the tech talent is, where people maybe have a lot of universities they go to, but also stay in those places as opposed to graduate and leave. All of that becomes really important. So collecting a lot of data for companies coming here is crucial.
And is that some of the service that your company offers?
Yes, so we touch on every point that I mentioned, from legal to operational to fundraising to healthcare, reimbursement, regulatory. And I am not a specialist in all of it, but through years of vetting, I partnered with the best experts in each field. So we bring in experts to work with companies who can really set the, sort of get them to the roadmap where they understand, first of all, the checklist of everything that they need to know. I always joke that sometimes companies don't know what they don't know, right? So understanding and shining a light at what they really need to know coming here, and then introducing them to people that can give very practical, very targeted advice, as opposed to self-promote and give infomercials, which some other programs do. I think that becomes really helpful.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
Which US states or which US cities seem to be the most welcoming to medtech or biosciences firms?
So I'm not going to, elevate some cities and trash in others, but I will say, as I mentioned before, that companies really need to collect the right data to make that decision. And the decision comes, what is the biggest and the fastest access to your customers, right? Where are your customers are? So companies go to where the customers are, partners are, and investors are. So evaluating regions and cities on that becomes important. And then if you look at 3 or 4 cities, let's say you decide you're a European company and it makes sense for you to be on the East Coast because of the closest connection to Europe, that makes logical sense. Then you need to look at the cities on the East Coast and figure out cost of living, cost of real estate, cost of talent. So compare that data. Some of the cities, and again, I'm not promoting, but some of the cities like Philadelphia might come up very favorably compared to oversaturated and really expensive Boston or New York, right? So do that comparison. However, if your clinical trials are in Boston, if your investor is in Boston, it makes sense for you to be in Boston, right? So we prepare companies for US market as a whole. We do love Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, and a lot of companies that graduate from us end up here because they already have ecosystem, they already have potential clients, they already have potential partners, and that plays a huge role. And because East Coast is so well connected, it's easy to be in Philly and go for investors in New York, for example, or Boston, right? So, but I always say, look for where international airports are, ports, it's important for your logistics, right? Trains. Not a lot of companies know how easy it is to get from Philly to New York or Washington for regulatory by train. So all of those considerations become really important. And then you also need to look at what different states give you as incentives, because every state wants to attract business to them. And so we teach companies on the example of Pennsylvania how to look to those incentives, and then they can extrapolate it to other states when they're looking for the best site selection.
Exactly.
Yeah, because here in Pennsylvania, for example, we have something called Keystone Innovation Zones and Keystone Opportunity Zones, where they give you tax abatement, they give you R&D credits. There's a lot of really goodwill associated with that. And so I always advise companies to look for that.
Yes, and I'm sure each state has its own incentives. As you
mentioned. Of course they do. Of course they do. Yes, but you need to look at incentives in sort of in connection with everything else, right? So you might have the best tax incentives, but if you cannot find talent, right? People trained in your field, let's say cell and gene therapy, you can go to Texas for state incentives, but if you cannot find a cell and gene therapy talent, you might not succeed there. So I'm not trashing Texas. I'm sure they have plenty of that talent, but yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. And conversely, when US tech companies or biotech companies go abroad, are there any countries or cities that seem to be most welcoming or that offer special incentives?
Well, again, a lot of countries are trying to lure business, especially US business. So there are a lot of incentives, and companies might not realize, but talking to economic development agencies is really beneficial. They can give you a lot of data, they can make connections for you. You should not do it alone, period. There's a lot of help, and a lot of help that is free of charge that you can take advantage of. So Italy has its own incentives. Germany has its own incentives. As I said, each region has its own incentives. But I think for US companies, it really makes sense to figure out where is the largest market opportunity. Again, I love the whole Europe, but it might make less sense to go to, country like Croatia versus Germany as the first entry, with a couple of exceptions. Some of the countries in Europe might be much cheaper for clinical trials and for regulatory. And in that case, it does make sense to go to a lower cost countries. So there's a lot of data that companies need to evaluate to make those decisions.
Yes, very true.
Mm-hmm.
Startups have very different challenges than established firms do when going abroad or coming here. What kinds of issues do they face that startups face that established companies don't face?
Yes, and I can actually reverse it too, because sometimes startups do have sort of an advantage too. But I would say startups always strapped for cash, right? So expanding to other markets is expensive. There's no way around it. And even if you already gain traction in your own country, and you think you might naturally expand to other markets, it will require additional capital. So understanding that and prioritizing fundraising then becomes really important, right? Also, we talked about how biosciences, MedTech is capital intensive. So you need to figure out where that capital is going to come from. Startups do not have established brands, so, versus established companies, and that's, a disadvantage. Although sometimes it's an advantage because startups could be really disruptive in a stagnant industry, right? They can come in and shine the light at the problems that bigger companies, overlooked because of the ways that business have been done for many, many years. So that's the biggest advantage, that they stay fast, nimble, agile, right? But they do require support. They do not have a lot of resources like established companies might have. And so it's it's a gymnastics at how to execute it well and become successful here. But it's equally challenging for established companies, and there are plenty of examples of well-established companies, legacy companies coming from European market to US and not succeeding with all the capital that they have. And that's mostly lies in cultural differences and understanding the cultural differences.
Can you give us an example about?
Yeah, I can give an example. There's a great book that just came out by a professor from Columbia called How to Make It in America. And he gives an excellent example of a German company, a well-established German company that makes windows. They corner the European market. They make phenomenal windows. They decided to come to US and they failed. And they failed in the US. Why? Because in Europe, as many of us know who go to Europe often, windows open vertically. It opens this way. In America, we open it this way. And so they did not take into account that cultural differences. How are we used to opening the windows here in the United States, right? It's silly, it's simple, but it's illustrative how every marketing decision needs to make sense. Yeah.
Okay. So opening vertically versus horizontally.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. There are a lot of great examples in that book, but yeah, I'll give you another example of cultural differences that companies need to understand. They really need to understand how business is done in the United States and how the customer behave here. There was a French company that used to sell product to surgeons. And in France, they would cold call surgeons and cold email, and that was how they were doing business development. Well, you and I both know you cannot cold call any head of surgery or surgeons in the United States because you will get nowhere with that. So just understanding how business practices work here with your customer segment is critical.
Very true. Yes. And knowing those kinds of failures, I think, are very illustrative for anyone going abroad, because obviously the industry simply transfers, but one has to understand the business practices, the sales practices, financing, funding, as you say, and how it all works, and to see whether your assumptions work in this country or in any country.
Yeah, even simple things like understanding the visa, right? So, okay, you're a company well established, let's say in Norway, and you start sending your salespeople or your technical people to do demos in the United States. Well, do they have a work right in the United States? What kind of visas are they going to have? What kind of contract do you have here in the United States that might affect their visa status? So all of this, that's what we're teaching. We're teaching all of the things that CEO might not even think through that they need to understand.
Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close?
So I just want to maybe say a few words about our program. So our program is a 6-week online accelerator, which means that companies do not have to come here physically to get that knowledge and to work with experts to really create their own roadmap for US expansion. And then we invite them to US to come here and meet with partners and investors. And right now we're partnering with a great science and technology park in Philadelphia, so they also can have a space here. So that works really great. I just want to tell you that Our next program starts in September, and the applications are open right now, and the due date is April 15th. But there are many, many programs. That's 2023, yes. There are many, many programs, the soft landing programs in the United States. And so understanding which program is right for you, it becomes critical because some cost a lot of money, some take equity, some are free. But as we know here in the United States, there is no such thing as free lunch, right? So please always look at how the program is structured and what it gives you. A lot of programs get sponsorship from big firms, accounting firms, law firms. And so that's fine and that's great. But what do you get out of it? You get an infomercial, essentially. So you really need to evaluate programs like this on their impact. We're very proud of our impact. If I could just say a few words, we graduated 54 companies so far, and 22 are now in the United States, with 7 being FDA approved. So statistically, only 1 in 5 companies succeeds in the United States. We're literally doubling the odds of companies being successful in the United States. And so I'm very proud of our statistics, but there are plenty of other programs. And so I encourage companies to go and evaluate all of them. And again, look for that catch, right? So how the program is structured, who is paying for it, what kind of impact it delivers.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Absolutely.
And I should add, for the benefit of all of our listeners and viewers, that on our website under auerbachinternational.com/podcasts, or under the media section of our website, which is where the podcasts are, in each podcast, you will see a listing of other products or services under the guest's bio and information. And WorldUpstart is listed there as one of the many services that we offer for all of our listeners and viewers and subscribers around the world.
Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, Karina. This has been a wonderful, very educational and enlightening session with Karina Sotnik. And I hope you will all join us next week for another edition of Global Gurus and their stories of international business. Thank you.
Thank you.